So I will be shifting from a critique of feminist psychology to a critique of Islamic psychology, because you can easily find a lot of the similar themes within these neoliberal religion, basically, within Islamic psychology as well, where Islamic psychology goes and anachronistically applies these new age ideas into Islamic psychology. When in fact, what's interesting is that not only is this new age stuff really, really old, it's older than Islam. It comes from a different tradition, which is really hilarious. It comes from these, you can find these themes in Zoroastrianism, which is a religion that Islam took over. What I'm talking about specifically is kind of like very similar to the Zen Buddhism stuff, where speak no evil, hear no evil, say no evil kind of thing, where the Islamic theology is kind of anachronistically taking that up as well, which is kind of hilarious. It's an appeasement of a neoliberal religion. You see, in our world where we have all of these different people, all of these different ideas, the different perspectives that are at war with each other, talking to each other, there's only one, or actually sometimes they don't talk to each other. There's only one real religion that creeps up from between the disagreements of these various points of views. The one disagreement being that of money, that of this neoliberal religion. You can see Osama bin Laden, who supposedly hates Islam, and this is a point. So, Harari talks about in his famous book that Osama bin Laden might dislike the United States and might hate the United States, but he would still accept a United States dollar, showing that what's actually going on is a much broader religion that's actually being appeased, a much bigger God than the God of Islam. Now, Habermas, in his Post-Metaphysical Thinking 2, talks about, and I'm really looking forward to a good translation of Habermas's magnum opus that has just come out about the history of philosophy, or the philosophy of history. In that work, he explains how there is a decision that every religious organization kind of has to make. And that religious organization basically has to make the decision between whether economics is an important aspect of their religion, or whether it needs to shun economics altogether. The problem is that economics is a much more powerful, in a way, God than any other God that we've ever had. So if you take the time to pray, maybe your prayer would be 50%, 50% you would get an answer. You pray to the Christian God or the Muslim God or any of the Hindu gods. However, if you pray to the God of the market and you say, I will work hard, I'll do what you ask me, God of the market, I will get a job and whatever, it's one day or another, you will get a response. And your response is whether you were successful or whether you were not successful. And, it's much more likely to get your Lamborghini from the God of the market than it is than any other God that just requires you to just sit there and pray and worship, because it's an out of worldly God. This is an old argument about that St. Augustine and Aquinas really, we can look to their disagreement about whether the kingdom of God is within this planet or somewhere outside of our finite universe. So there's going to be another video critiquing specifically the theology of the Quran before I even get into the psychology, this new age psychology that the Quran and these YouTube philosophers, these YouTube Islamic philosophers are taking up. And I'm going to be holding them to task sooner or later. But before I do that, I'm just going to do a traditional critique of the Quran. And in order to transition from my critique of identity politics in the traditional sense, ironically, towards this new kind of identity politics that's being taken up by conservatives and people within Islam, which I think is super fascinating, I'm going to be pointing to an article that, again, in our time of Huxley and dystopia, just another little side this traditional debate between Orwell and Huxley, between a world where there's too much information, this Huxleyan world where there's so much noise that we don't know what's what, and the other world where, in a Orwellian world, in a world where there is so little information, where books are being burned. The problem is that these two worlds in our present day internet ideological apparatus, these two worlds are not separate from one another. In fact, they work much together. And Zizek was just talking with Douglas Lane about how we can't even talk about the prohibition itself. You have to pretend it's a prohibition of talking about the prohibition, which is this really intense sort of fascism when they themselves, these people, and I'm talking about all of this cancel culture, whether it's the TERFs or whether it's the Judith Butler people, they are always canceling one another. And then we are all having to pay for their inability to take on that collective trauma, their inability to take on the complicity for their own participation. An idea of safe space doesn't mean you are safe from critique, which unfortunately now it does, even for people who were once part of this kind of movement, which is me. And it's this Robespierre moment where you're next in line for the guillotine, even though you were part of the movement, right? And that's what they're doing to each other. They're telling each other it's too much emotional labor to handle each other. And they're doing this, my trauma is more important than your trauma game, which is really scary. And I want to look at this article, and I'm going to be interjecting at some points, not too much, because I want this article to speak for itself mostly. So without further ado, it's called Afro-Pessimism and the Unlogic of Anti-Blackness. The meme of militant Black America has allowed to cannibalize the broader traditions of resistance within which these militants were situated. Identity politique. The problem. In the late afternoon of February 10th, 2015, local police in Chapel Hill responded to a report of fired shots. I love, first of all, this dramatic introduction that we're given. And second, I want to say something before I continue. In 2015, I was in China. I was a teacher in China. And I came back from China in 2016, 2017 to discover that the left was totally broken. And I didn't really know what was going on. I had a completely different mission. I wanted to go and discover China and see what's going on in China. And I discovered the most terrible things there. And I came back to find that we have so many tankies here. And that was really scary for me. So back to the article. They entered a Finley Forest condominium to find the lifeless bodies of 3 young Arabs. The first, Dia Barakat, lay dead in the front doorway. The others, his wife Yusur and his sister Razan Abu Salah, had been slain in the kitchen. All 3 had been killed with gunshots to the head in an execution-style murder. Over the coming hours and days, as details emerged on social media, it became clear that these young Muslims had been murdered in a hate crime. Seeing this in the context of state-sponsored Islamophobia, which had fueled a growing climate of harassment and hate crimes against Muslims in the US, as well as the mass slaughter of civilians in drone attacks across the Middle East, activists online started using the hashtag Muslim Lives Matter, which was tweeted over 100,000 times to challenge the lack of coverage. Just as another side note, I've noticed that if you fill out a identity report for whatever job you're filling out, Arabs and Middle Eastern people are seen as white on there, when in fact those people are not actually included within the white hemisphere who get to decide who is in what category, which is kind of a little bit outrageous because the Arab people not only do not get any privileges of the white people in reality, but they are also, on the other hand, dealt with as if they are as white people, and they have to go through the same kinds of privileged training that white people go through, which is interesting. It's kind of this, because of this Afro-Pessimism thing. The outcry surrounding the use of hashtag Muslim Lives Matter came swiftly. Those outraged onlookers, drawing on the language of the most visible movement for racial justice in the United States at the time, Black Lives Matter, were met with charges of reductiveness, appropriation, and most potently, anti-Blackness. As one contributor to MuslimGirl.com wrote, the pattern of violence against Black people, specifically Black people, is a unique one, with both history and implications that will never be compared to the struggles of other communities of color in the United States. Institutional racism and the discrimination against Black people is evident in our courts, our prisons, and our entire justice system. What's really another terrible thing here is the American-centric kind of perspective within the analysis here. So what happens is that the American ideological realm is exported to the rest of the world, and we all have to respond to Donald Trump as if it was our problem. Back to the article. Frank B. Wilderson III explicitly sets to disanalogize the violence of white supremacy and that of anti-Blackness. We have seen this pattern emerging for some time. By the way, this is a report called the Black Agenda Report, so I'm just assuming that this person, Annie Olaloku-Teriba, in fact, I think she's from Africa, but I'm just going to assume that she's from Africa because it's really a perspective that can only come out of Africa, not out of an American perspective. I could be completely wrong, so please don't quote me on that. Later on, maybe someone could prove that I was wrong about my prediction there. We have seen this pattern emerging for some time. On the one hand, the exceptionalization of a thing referred to as anti-Blackness, and on the other, the mobilization of this charge against non-Black people of color who attempted to draw comparisons between Black struggles and their own. In a 2016 lecture entitled Irreconcilable Anti-Blackness, Frank B. Wilderson III explicitly set out to disanalyze the violence of white supremacy and that of anti-Blackness. While his argument, counterposing the logical nature of racism experienced by so-called non-Black people of color to the supposed gratuity and incoherence of violence directed at Black people, is central to the relatively small but growing body of literature within the theoretical frame of Afro-Pessimism, echoing this broader set of trends. Entrenched in anti-racist theory and practice today is the belief that all racial and ethnic domination is structured around global hierarchy with white people at the top and Black people at the bottom. This shift was necessarily coincided with the increasing purchase of the notion of an historically coherent ethnic Blackness in theoretical and political spaces. Together, this set of beliefs, as in Wilderson's earlier mentioned title, has been given voice through the increasing prevalence of the concept of anti-Blackness. Thus, the tension between the presumptions of this universalizing analysis of categories and the as yet unresolved question of Blackness, what is it and who possesses it, plagues anti-racist politics and organizing. I couldn't agree more. This is really good, right? Consequently, the limitations, I couldn't agree more because this is a universalist thing that's almost being pushed out of America and onto the farthest reaches of the globe as it applies everywhere, when this post-colonial situation is specifically an American problem that can't at all be applied to absolutely everywhere in the world. Yes, we all have our own version and our own particularity into post-colonialism, and I think this woman is really on the dot. Indeed, Blackness can be conjured in a myriad of curious ways, and there remains a conceptual confusion around this term which deserves more attention than it is thusly given. This article will therefore show the necessity of interrogating this increasingly dominant conception of Blackness and the assumptions it invests in correlating theories of anti-Blackness. Huey took the question of race in the USA and framed it as merely one iteration of Americans' incursions on collective self-determination. That's amazing. Huey himself says that this is a particular thing, and each state has a different relationship towards racism and cannot be universalized. Huey himself, the American leader of anti-racism. Regardless, this is not what we have. We don't have, it's not Huey that's leading. It's actually more of a feminist thing. It's more of a identity politics. I blame feminism because they have started that emotional labor argument, and that emotional labor argument makes us unable to actually be able to critique ourselves. So I blame bell hooks for this kind of culture, and then the secondary blame goes to Roxane Gay. Bell hooks, Roxane Gay feminism, intersectional feminism, which is what I think is really scary. The exceptionalism with which anti-Black racism is treated, along with the territoriality over what deemed particularly Black registers of resistance in this increasingly powerful assemblage of analyses, stands in stark contrast to the most prevalent traditions of Black anti-imperialist organizing in the 60s and 70s. The Black Panther Party lent both their name and 10-point program model to various anti-imperialist groups, including the Dalit Panthers, the politically British Black Panther movement, and the Puerto Rican Young Lords Party. Indeed, the party was among the first political groups in the US to attempt to integrate the antagonism between Blackness and whiteness into a broader theory of racial dynamics through the Minister of Defense Huey P. Newton's concept of intercommunalism. Huey took the question of race in the USA and framed it as merely one iteration of America's incursion on collective self-determination. By reframing the Black-white antagonism within the context of a broader critique of US imperialism, intercommunalism conceived Blackness as historically contingent and aspired to the abolition of race altogether. Amazing. So I think maybe we can pick up this concept of intercommunalism to fight this concept of intersectionality. We need intercommunalism to fight the intersectionality. Hopefully I'll make that the title of this video. Where has this newer politics come from? I argue that these political impulses arise an increasing disconnection from the intellectual history of the last period of anti-colonial insurgency. And there's a reason for that. The CIA reads what's going on. They platform people. They platform people strategically. It's not just a Google, Reddit, feminist movement that tries to platform straw man and cut out actual critique, which was my point before about how Huxley and Orwell are not mutually exclusive. We need to look at Ray Bradbury as our main guy. We live in a Bradburian world. We need to come up with a name for that, Bradburian world, because books are being burnt and knowledge is hard to find. And that's actually, I want to make a point about that before I started reading this article, which was it's so hard to find articles like this right now. You have to actually go out of your way. You have to go out of your media ecosystem and really find critique. And that's really part of this dystopian world that we live in. I can't find any meaningful critique in this world because prohibition itself is prohibited to talk about. That's what's crazy. Sorry if I repeat myself. The radical politics of the 60s has been recast with the anti-racist frame, the genesis of a new left from which the identitarianism can ostensibly trace its roots. This is no accident. As Kinga Yamata Taylor stressed, there has been a concerted effort on the part of the political establishments to obscure the history of the last era of Black insurgency in the US. Indeed, I think she gets it, that there's actually some more nefarious kind of thing going on. It's not just the loudest people talking. There's a really coherent, and this might be conspiracy theory stuff, but there's a reason why men and women are at each other's throats. There's a reason why, and it's not because it's just simple identity politics. There's people who are directing all of this. In my conspiratorial, paranoid perspective, I think it's the Democratic establishment, the Democratic Party, but whatever. That's just, I'm just going to leave that to the side. Bracket my paranoia, please. Indeed, there have been three central tenets of this erasure. I'm going to repeat that 3 times. First, the collapsing of the hugely diverse political traditions represented in the Black liberation struggles in the 60s and 70s into a nebulous concept of Black Power era. Second, the extraction of the period of insurgency from its international context. Perfect. That is really key. There used to be alliances between Che Guevara and, all these guys. The meme of militant Black America has been allowed to cannibalize the broader traditions of resistance within which those militants were situated. The 60s and 70s were a buoyant period of the oppressed and exploited, as Huey Newton characterizes it. Afro-Americans were in fact late to the party. And you gotta take a look at these articles so you can look at the citations for yourself. Third, the conceptual separation between domestic and international resistance. This has facilitated the replacement of anti-imperialist, that is transnational, that is anti-colonial, that is what I'm trying to bring back here with my channel, frames of thinking with anti-racist, that is national ones. That is the framing of Fanon and bringing of Fanon into this and there's going to be a debate here about what exactly Fanon is saying here. The revival of racialism, that's perfect. I think racialism is a really good word here. This person is really right on the dot, and I'm going to really praise her right here. The revival of racialism has been the death of genuine solidarity, shaping the political imagination of this generation of theorists and activists for the worse. Absolutely, right? If people can't talk about the differences, if we can't even be able to speak, there's no authenticity in our movement here. We just, the white people have to shut up. And then if you're a little bit darker, you can say some things. It's really crazy. It's really essentialist. Back to the work. The revival of racialism has been the death of genuine solidarity. Perfect. Curiously, while the framework has been pervasive in structuring thought on the question of race, no concerted effort has been made to establish what anti-Blackness means. Embedded in the vagueness of this ethical critique of racism is a set of myths and mystifications around the nature of race. This whole thing is made to shut people up, especially the writer of this article. Look at the response that the writer of this article has gotten by various people, probably just white people. That's so crazy. Or, people who think that they have the power to shut people up. Crucial to this is the absence of a coherent and historically informed definition of Black. In many ways, the recent theoretical interventions of the movement of thought termed Afro-Pessimism have both shaped and been shaped by these developments. Thus, this article seeks to intervene in contemporary debates around the nature of race, racism, and racial liberation through a sustained critique of growing Afro-Pessimism literature. I will first address the emergence of Afro-Pessimism, indexing it to a particular development in anti-racist organizing. Then I will provide a critique of two key premises of Afro-pessimist literature: the subsumation of the world by the slave relation. I'm going to read that again because that's what I was saying before, except I was saying it as in terms of the American perspective being the central aspect of the world. The subsumation of the world by the slave relation. And B, the subsumation of Africanness by an Americanized conception of Blackness. So she's here doing exactly what I'm doing. I'm here defending my locality, which is my village. And what she's doing is she's defending her village. She's defending her Africanness. I'm defending my Gilakiness. If you don't know where Gilan is, Gilan, please Google it. Educate yourself about all of the cultures of the world, please. This woman gives me so much energy. She gives me so much power. Thank you. In my conclusion, I assess the implications of these assumptions for contemporary politics and point to an engagement with the radical politics of the Black Panther Party and its contemporaries as a possible route towards more productive thinking. Thank you. Thank you, lady. I'm so proud of your article here. I have found my new bell hooks. Something in the water. In Badagry, Nigeria, a slave town built by a former slave turned slaver. I want to repeat that. Throughout my texts, throughout my work, I've always said that complicity is more important than intersectionality. And here she speaks of complicity being more important than intersectionality. A slave town built by a former slave turned slaver. We need to take up that complicity. We need to take up that responsibility. Thank you. Once again, I'm not going to stop thanking this person. Between the barracoon on the mainland and the point of no return beyond the small body of water, where slaves become cargo on ships, lies the spirit of attenuation. Attenuation. I'm just going to pause there and Google that word for a second, not just for me, but for the rest of humanity. Attenuation is the weakening of a signal's strength due to noise, distance, or other external factors. Attenuation in ultrasound is the reduction in amplitude of the ultrasound beam as a function of distance through the imaging medium. Amazing. Lies the spirit attenuation. So she's using that word to describe, I guess, slavery, which is really nice. And it's a powerful word that she's using to describe this horror. And she's so strong in doing that, so powerful in doing such work like this. It's for a person who is not part of this story. I'm looking at an outsider in. When you study this slavery stuff, you can't help but cry. You can't help but go through the hardcore emotional labor that is required to read what humans have done to one another. And yes, I don't have an endless heart for that. I can only read so much. This word is so powerful, I think, and that's why I'm pausing on it for so long. It's not like I don't know what this word means. I just need to look at a couple definitions for a second and just take it in and think about my own studies of racism and how spirit attenuation, for her to bring up in such a short amount this word that so precisely almost describes what's going on from an outsider in. I don't know what's going on, but okay, back to the text. Where slaves become cargo on ships lies the spirit attenuation, well which provided the final source of water for hundreds of thousands of slaves who were destined for the Americas. Following reports of slave rebellions on the earlier ships which killed several European slavers, Yoruba slavers responded by charming the water. Today, local legends still hold that to drink from the well will result in memory loss, a complete dislocation of one's history. It is believed that the powerful charm left slaves ready to be remade as slavers desired because it took from them the memory of freedom. In many ways, the slave in this carefully kept local history resembles the remaking of blackness itself in Afro-pessimist literature. Malcolm X, the X in Malcolm. Here we find the blackness unmoored from time and space by a ruthless disregard for material historical processes. When read with Fanon, the psychoaffective quagmire from which the colonized intellectual must wrench himself, individuals without anchorage, without borders, colorless, stateless, rootless, a body of angels. At the heart of this blackness, which both preceded the transatlantic slave trade and is created by it, there is no memory before the slave ship. Those various socio-political formations on the African continent documented locally, which both predated and gave life to the transfer of people across the Atlantic Ocean on an industrial scale, cannot and do not exist. In other words, to be racialized as black and to be a slave are treated as one and the same. So this is actually a critique. First question that comes to me is this Adorno's idea of there not being able to produce any poetry after the Holocaust. The only poetry that can remain, that even becomes even more poetic, is the first line of a poem. Whatever slight memories that you have had, whatever remains, the fragments. Let's keep going. Afro-pessimism, as Jared Sexton has pointed out, has largely developed through the proliferation of social media platforms in the same moment when the Professorate groans under the intensified administrative command to turn research into output with eventual market value. Thus, the position that leading Afro-pessimist scholars such as Frank B. Wilderson and Sexton hold within the academy is in large part dependent on the following that they have garnered among organizers. This, in part, explains the ascendancy of what was once a highly technical dispute in a small corner of the American academy to a structuring logic of various political formations in the era of #Black Lives Matter. Afro-Pessimism, so she puts the hashtag there. Afro-Pessimism is a crucial literature to engage with, precisely because it is both shaped and being shaped by the organizational impulses of Afro-American and Black British activists in particular. That is, people who have access to the internet. Calling it #Black Lives Matter is an interesting one. It brings in a whole new perspective of media studies. To be racialized as Black and to be a slave are treated as one and the same. To engage Afro-pessimism is, in many ways, to take aim at a moving target. On the one hand, the body of literature which Sexton describes as a movement of thought sprawls in multiple directions. Culture, society, and political struggle have all had the Afro-pessimist gaze turn on them, churning out articles and citations in large numbers, in explaining the increasing organization of far-right groups as demonstrated by the events of Charlottesville. One prominent British commentator mused that Afro-pessimism is the best history of Africa. The breadth of analysis that it has inspired is certainly striking. On the other hand, much of the literature itself is near impenetrable for the layperson. It rests on both the peculiar invocation of various canonical figures of Black liberation tradition and the collectivization of various registers of Blackness. This has meant that the literature typically mediated through reductive simplification and is sometimes contradicting conclusions taken at face value. Some points of clarification are therefore necessary. First, though the literature of Afro-pessimism is broad, these texts are and often confess to be largely derivative of the parameters set out in advancement and enactment of Afro-pessimism in the work of Frank B. Wilderson III and Jared Sexton. To this end, I will primarily be engaging their work. Second, my thoughts on Afro-pessimism are structured by a distinction between those who identify themselves as Afro-pessimists, Sexton and Wilderson, etc., and those who work with respectively drafted by Afro-pessimists into their project, Fanon, Hortense Spillers, Steve Biko, James Baldwin, etc. So people who have been taken up by the Afro-pessimist project. In fact, people who critique this person's article, I'm going to stop saying this person. I have to remember her name. Her name is Olaloku-Teriba. Olaloku-Teriba. Okay? I have to remember this name because she's the Baldwin of the present. Oh my goodness. Amazing. Amazing work. So the people who critique Olaloku-Teriba say that she's misreading these people like Fanon and Baldwin, and the correct way to read them is within the realm of Sexton and Wilderson. This distinction is especially important in the case of Afro-pessimism because the framework of the thing developed by the former often relies on partial and self-serving readings of the latter. Third, I seek to engage the theoretical structure and pessimisms of Afro-pessimisms, beginning with its conception of Blackness. The position that the leading Afro-pessimist scholars hold within the academy is in large part dependent on the following that they have garnered amongst their organizers. In this, I mean to distinguish my contribution from Fred Moten Black optimism, in which Afro-pessimism has found a comfortable antagonist. Against the space that Moten opens between the fact of Blackness and the lived experiences of the Black, the irreducible and impossible sociality of Black life, I posit a reintegration of the notion of Blackness as a fissure whose character we can easily assume. Indeed, Moten accepts Wilderson's claim that the bridge between blackness and anti-blackness is the unbridgeable gap between black being and human life, but neither attempt to elaborate the meanings of blackness beyond the assumption of a coherence between Africa and her slave diasporas. Upon interrogation, Sexton's assumption that the slave is paradigmatically black brings two axioms to the fore. The first, the instance that the position of the slave is necessarily black. Black here is to be found in a morphological sense or understood in a morphological sense. However, this must be taken with the second axiom in order that the implicit biological definition of black cohere. Slaveness links the Negro and the African. Wilderson articulates it thus. Slaveness is something that has been consumed by blackness and Africanness, making it impossible to divide slavery from blackness. The manner in which Africanness appears or disappears into blackness ought to be suspect. It suggests that slaveness is the thing that connects the Negro to the African with no move to elaborate the causal logic. This is insanity, right? Afro-pessimism is really insanity. It's taking up the white man's logic. It's crazy. And yet, I just to pause here and give Afro-pessimism its due. Perhaps it's the case to show that the situation is so bad. It feels like they believe it. I don't know. I have to... it's so difficult here. And yet, it is from these seemingly incontestable assumptions that the Afro-pessimist imaginary springs forth. The Afro-pessimist imaginary springs forth from whatever the white man said a long time ago. The Afro-pessimist imaginary is the white man's imaginary, the white racist man's imaginary. The following takes aim at these twin axioms in turn because the stakes are so high. As I will show, the veiled interlocutor of Afro-pessimism is not the white master, but what has in recent times been termed the non-black person of color. The paradigmatic blackness of the slave in Afro-pessimism acts not to establish the anti-blackness of white supremacy, but the supposed anti-blackness of the non-black person of color. The white must challenge her racism, but the Native American, Arab, Asian, or Latino must root out the anti-blackness which surely inscribed in the shadiest corners of their minds. Indeed, both Sexton and Wilderson explicitly take aim at non-black people of color. This is why I call this colonialism. This is why I call this neocolonialism. How else are you going to take over the non-black people of color? You take over them using intersectionality. That's me, man. We saw this in action and it's insane because I'm deemed as white. Man, we saw this in action when York University black graduate students. We saw this in action when the York University Black Graduate Students Collective called an all-people to boycott a 2016 Israeli Apartheid Week event on campus, which featured a journalist, Rania Khalek. In an anti-black racism bulletin, they declared her as notoriously anti-black, with no elaboration of her apparent offenses. Twitter was far more vocal in its charges. On the one hand, I wish I was there for all this stuff. Too bad I was in China. On the one hand, a previous questioning of what she referred to as segregated organizing, when Black Lives Matter asked white people not to attend a Cleveland gathering, was taken an offensive appropriation of a painful chapter of Afro-American history. On the other, the deeper charge was her attempts to analogize Black and other anti-imperialist struggles framed by many popular bloggers as appropriation. This has come to head with her consistent critique of the Obamas as symbols of racial justice, while U.S. drone strikes waged destruction on Pakistan and Yemen. Look at these people defending Obama as if Obama is the sign or was the sign of anti-blackness or anti-racism. Obama's the establishment, people. The manner in which Africanness disappears into blackness ought to be suspect. In the debate that ensued, Juju Jones, a blogger, invoked Frank Wilderson on ahistorical comparisons between black struggle and the fight to free Palestine. Commenting on comparisons between the plight of Palestinians and Afro-Americans, Wilderson says, "That's just bullshit. First, there's no time period in which black police and slave domination have ever ended. Second, the Arabs and the Jews are as much part of the black slave trade, creation of blackness as social debt, as anyone else. Here, Wilderson's work is not to situate the European settler colonial project given life through Israel within a broader anti-imperialist frame. Instead, he makes two theoretical moves. First, to reject the analogy between the carceral violence of two settler colonial states. Second, to place Palestinians, equated in his comments with Arabs, great point, and their colonizers, equated in his comments with Jewishness, in a solidarity of anti-blackness through a significant role in the black slave trade. The historical conflation of Wilderson's claim and the contortions that are required for him to find himself there, notwithstanding, he goes on to tie this impossibility of true contemporary solidarity. As I told a friend of mine, yeah, we're going to help you get rid of Israel, but the moment that you set up your shit, we're going to be right there to jack you up, because anti-blackness is important and necessary to the formation of Arab psychic life as it is the formation of Jewish psychic life. This is why there's no solidarity, people. We know once they get over their own hurdles, the anti-blackness that sustains them will rear its ugly head against us, so that we don't fall into a sort of genuine bonding with people who are really primarily using black energy to catalyze and energize their struggle. And this kind of logic has been subsumed within the Palestinian struggle too, kind of destroying the Palestinian struggle. I went to a Palestinian struggle protest a couple months ago, and I was really disappointed as what was going on. That's going to be a whole, I have a video on that. So many videos to do. This saga and Wilderson's referenced comments rest on a set of four intertwined logics. A. Race is necessarily globally consistent, a science of continental bloodwork. B. Blackness is a stable category referring to a historically coherent people whose experience of violence are necessarily tied by a common ethnicity. There is clearly identifiable us. The phenomenon of anti-blackness is exceptional, existing in a register of experience that is essentially different to all other experiences of racism, and the analogization by people of color of various manifestations of racism and imperialism insofar as it draws on black experiences and therefore black energy is tantamount to anti-blackness. Wilderson and Sexton are holding up fading Polaroids and asking us to see a panoramic tapestry. Wilderson and Sexton are holding up fading Polaroids and asking us to see a panoramic tapestry. Beautiful. No doubt, the institution of chattel slavery, along with the material processes for which the phrase stands, has become a shorthand, a palimpsestic afterlife. The conjuring of racialism to salvage the practice of slavery has left an indelible mark, underwriting the script of the repressive state apparatus of the U.S. state. Who is all of this benefiting? She's on the money. However, Afro-Pessimism has mistaken a single frame for the afterlife of slavery, and a partial frame at that. Palimpsetic means that there is a parchment paper that's reused for other things. Exactly what something like the U.S. state would do. Central to this project is it's a deep form of cultural appropriation. It's a much deeper form of cultural appropriation. It's a continuation of the noble savage kind of liberal racism, masked as anti-racism, masked as progress, masked as something that we should shut people out for, and if they don't agree, they are immoral. and they don't care about human beings. All of this feeds this hatred from, oh my goodness, this is right on the money. Central to this project is an ambivalence concerning the success of liberatory struggles of anti-colonial insurgency, enforcing the subject of racial domination to hurriedly scrawl all over the script to salvage the political order that he had created through the second half of the 20th century. Wilderson and Sexton are therefore holding up fading Polaroids and asking us to see a panoramic tapestry. Through this elucidation, I argue that the debate around political blackness raging in the United Kingdom is not so parochial after all, thus setting the stage for the crucial questions about the intramural dynamics of anti-racist political formations today. Master and slave transformed. Like Marxism, black consciousness has been hobbled in an essential way. Fundamental to Marxism is the notion that the world is unethical due to its subsumption by relations of capital. That what we learn from Fanon and others is that the world is unethical due to the subsumation by slave relations. This is the Wilderson reading of Fanon. Out of slavery, the Negro bursts in the list where his master stood, like those servants who were allowed once every year to dance in the drawing room. The Negro is looking for a prop. The Negro has not become a master where there are no longer slaves. There are no longer masters. But the Negro knows nothing of the cost of freedom, for he has not fought for it. Friends, Fanon. There is long and justifiably maligned reductionist line that posits racism as simply a seed of division sown by the bosses to divide the workers. This line, both when it is used to argue that calls to combat racism amongst workers are unnecessarily divisive, and when it is used to argue that challenging racism is necessary for revolutionary politics, treats race as significant only insofar as it is an obstacle to class unity. As noted by contributors to Racism Research Project in 1975, we continue to lack a distinctly Marxist account of racialization. In the absence of a coherent theoretical framework which roots the superstructural phenomenon of racialization in the economic processes that demand it, many Marxists have succumbed to this essentially conspiratorial account of racism, or have been content to allow this crucial theoretical gap to fester. Seemingly, without an economic base, racism has increasingly been treated as a purely social relation, distinct and inextricable from class. Consequently, Marxist scholars have instead typically approached the question of race through resistance, emphasizing solidarity as instances in which the barriers of race has been overcome to achieve working class unity. This has meant that an integration of the crisis to which racialization responds has been largely left by the wayside. In the absence of a coherent theoretical framework which roots the superstructural phenomenon of racialization in the economic processes that demand it, many Marxists have succumbed to this essentially conspiratorial account of racism. So these are the manarchists and the tankies, I guess, or some tankies. I don't even know what tankies mean anymore. It is into this conceptual space, or the economic reductionists. Now, I think I'm just going to interject here with one thing that Adrian Johnston said. It's not that the people who are looking at the economy or looking at racial relations are reducing everything to economic relationships. They're not reducing all of these different forms of oppression into the question of class. What's actually happening is that the economic system itself is what is reducing everything to the question of class. I thought that was really on the point. It is into this conceptual space that Afro-pessimist literature inserts itself. The mistake of this Marxist orthodoxy, Afro-pessimists argue, is in its attempt to subsume an ostensibly different phenomenon of white supremacy under the banner of capitalism. Thus, it argues race belongs to the realm of the structurally determined, a global juggernaut organized around a hierarchy of morphological groups which provides the real antagonism for modernity. As Frank B. Wilderson III intimates, the black subject reveals a Marxism's inability to think white supremacy as the base, and in so doing, calls into question Marxism's claim to elaborate a comprehensive, or in other words, in the words of Antonio Gramsci, decisive antagonism. Dude, don't take up Gramsci, bro. The United States, he argues, is constructed at the intersection of both a capitalist and white supremacist matrix, but Marxism is impotent to face the latter. It is taken for granted that this can be generalized globally. I think Marxism is also impotent against the former too, actually. The notion advanced by Afro-Pessimism is that ethnically black is paradigmatically different from any other racial group, rests primarily on the presumption of the master-slave dynamic, is essentially racialized. The tension emerges as Sexton and Wilderson go further. For them, it is neither race nor racism which structures white supremacy. Rather, white supremacy is just one iteration of a global anti-black solidarity. Black is not a race, since black are the antagonists of the very category of human, and yet it is. Indeed, the category of ontological non-being, which Sexton and Wilderson identify, relies heavily on the assumptive logic of race. Following from Patrick Wolf's paradox, this in itself is a powerful sign that the extent to which racial ideology has embedded itself in our capacity to conceptualize difference. Thus, the purportedly distinctive dynamic between the human and the black is widely articulated through anti-blackness and its contemporary accoutrements, gathering. I can't pronounce this word. Contemporary accoutrement. Okay? I hate when French words are just sneaky. Okay. Today, the concept of anti-blackness has come to signify not only the particularity of racism against those deemed black, but also the centrality of such racism to all paradigms of racial domination. In this sense, Afro-Pessimism emerges from the tradition of ethnocentric analysis, which focuses on the particular intensity of systematic white domination of black people. However, Afro-Pessimism marks a departure from this tradition through a theorization of anti-blackness that takes aim at other racially dominated groups as fundamentally and irredeemably implicated in the domination of black people. The notion that to be ethnically black is paradigmatically different from any other racial group rests primarily on the presumption of the master-slave dynamic is essentially racialized. Afro-pessimists want us to think that through these relationships as existing on different Afro-pessimists want us to think through these relationships as existing on different planes between the poor white and the white master, and between the non-black person of color and the white. There is a sort of reasoned violence. For the black, on the other hand, there is a primarily gratuitous violence, existing in a state of incomprehensible external superviolence and internalized self-hatred. Wilderson renders this logic explicit when he asserts every other group lives in a context of violence which has what I would call a sort of psychological grounding wire, which means that they can write a sentence about why they are experiencing that violence. For a black person to try and emulate a kind of interpretive lens, the problem becomes a lot bigger. For us, in this ongoing tactic of a strategy for human renewal. For us, this is an ongoing tactic of a strategy for human renewal. This emerges from a reading of Fanon that begins from the points where he seems at loss to explain what he is confronted with. Contrasting Fanon to Marx, Wilderson comments that the slave relation relegates the capital relation to a conflict and not to the antagonism that Marx thought it to be. Crucial to his argument is the idea that Fanon's critique of Hegel's master-slave dialectic sets out to show some essential difference between the worker-capitalist relation and the Negro-white master relation. Wilderson goes on to assert that were the worker-capitalist relation to be solved, were it to cease to exist as a relation after the victory of the proletariat, the world would still be consumed or subsumed by the slave relation, an antagonism not between the position of the worker and that of the boss, but between the human and the black. This reading treats Fanon's black skin, white mask as a series of independent moments, disregarding his emphasis on temporality in the introduction. In a lecture titled after one of his articles, Sexton argues that these moments are in tension, constituting a slippage between the universal denunciation of all exploitation and the conceptual conflation of all such suffering under the broadest heading. It therefore effaces the relationship between these moments of complete despair and his moments of clarity, where these mystifications of race, the burden of incomprehensibility that they impose, and the nihilism which they invite are turned on their head within the same text through the illuminating capacity of struggle. Turning, for example, to Fanon's essay on the Negro and recognition embedded in his critique of Hegel's master-slave dialectic is a striking demystification. Clarifying his motivation, Fanon writes, "I hope I have shown that here the master differs basically from the master described by Hegel. For Hegel, there is reciprocity. Here, the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. Where he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. In the same way, the slave here is in no way identifiable with the slave who loses himself in the object and finds in his work the source of his liberation. The Negro wants to be like the master. Therefore, he is less independent than the Hegelian slave. In Hegel, the slave turns away from the master and turns toward the object. Here, the slave turns toward the master and abandons the object." What does Fanon mean when he says that the master wants from the slave is not recognized but work? Recognition. What does Fanon mean when he says that what the master wants from the slave is not recognition but work? Against Hegel's absolute reciprocity, Fanon advances a conception of the Negro slave as the alienated epitome of exploitation, which is to say that the master and the slave in Fanon's account are not produced by a relation of anti-blackness in the new life that this term has taken on, but by exploitation. This harkens back to Wilderson's earlier misreading of production between master and slave. This priority is reiterated elsewhere when Fanon takes aim at attempts to assert a global blackness. Negroes are in the process of disappearing, since those who created them are witnessing the demise of their economic and cultural supremacy. Fanon is less concerned with the slave as an opposing pole from which man has built community. He has no such illusions about the material existence of white fraternity. Culture, he argues, is first and foremost national in nature. Instead, Fanon is concerned with how profits from her labor finance society. We might then think of the position of the slave as the capitalist aspiration of all workers, stripped of all which renders her recognizable, the worker as a mere mechanism, but possible only through the mystification of race. In contrast to Wilderson's assertion that an ensemble of ontological questions that has as its foundation accumulation and fungibility as a grammar of suffering, exclusively marking the black as outside of a humanist discourse, that which has at its foundation alienation and exploitation as a grammar of suffering. The master-slave relation which Fanon proposes upsets this binary. Fanon's elucidation exposes the slave as contingently black, not paradigmatically black. What's the difference? The Afro-pessimist sees the world as structured by a non-black solidarity in preventing the ontological possibility of black life. Were black meant as a metaphor for the condition of total alienation from self, this might make sense. However, because the Afro-pessimist imaginary ties itself to a morphological account of blackness, this leads us to a theoretical dead end. In this worldview, it is therefore becomes necessary to begin by treating race as a problem fundamentally rooted in the formation of sociality, in which black precedes the historical order and the processes, both violent and mundane, which create her. By contrast, to think through the implications of contingency is to confront the reality that these racial categories that Wilderson and Sexton treat as absolute, are actually unstable, as evidence that something else is afoot.
It is to see race not as an anchor, but as a mystification conjured to weather crises of legitimacy. The Afro-pessimist sees the world as structured by a non-black solidarity in preventing the ontological possibility of black life. For example, we can examine how Sexton links the conditions of the Afro-American slave, the free black, and the African thus. Because blackness serves as the basis of enslavement in the logic of transnational political and legal culture, it permanently destabilizes the positions of any nominally free black population. The presumption of a shared, presumably global, legal and political culture within which the assertion that blackness was a basis of enslavement might be made is quite mistaken. Even in the US, the centralization of the legal and political status of blacks only emerged at the moment of formal abolition following the American Civil War. Prior to this, the internal border system of the US produced divergent rationales and attended judicial technology for enslavement. The South might be considered to fit the relationship that Sexton suggests. For example, the Supreme Court judges in Georgia argued that the free black was associated still with the slave in the state. However, the North tells a different story, wherein free blacks were likened to white women and children, denied many political rights, but did not therefore forfeit their basic status as citizens. In any case, the debates within slave states in the late antebellum period included the proposition of forcing their free black populations to elect between re-enslavement and leaving the state. The concerns of legislators and judges in the South that free black populations might inspire slave revolts and undermine the racial order indicate that their motivations were not paradigmatic but pragmatic. This is to say that these political and legal elites were well aware of the fragility of the racial order they had created. Indeed, on the relationship between the free black and the slave, a sketch of the thinking of legislators in the northern and southern states offers a radically different picture to Sexton's. Rather than being given the position of the free black was contested and geographically dependent. Interestingly, during an 1820 congressional debate regarding a clause in Missouri's proposed constitution which would bar free blacks from entering the state, it was the condition of Native Americans which structured the logic regarding the position of free blacks. The Indians born in the states continued to be aliens, and so I contend, so do the free Negroes. Contrary to Sexton's assertions of the exceptional nature of the Afro-American experience in this regard, legislators consciously rooted their positions in a nexus of other undesirables, which included both Native Americans and white paupers. The preoccupation with the condition of poor whites is certainly not a new phenomenon. Legislators in the antebellum South were consumed with the implications of white pauperism, which meant that The adjudged pauper is subordinate to the will of others and reduced to a condition but little removed from that of chattel slavery, and until recently, by statute of 1847, section 12, the slave was liable to be sold upon the block of an auctioneer for service or support. Moreover, it is important to note that the northern and southern states pre-offered different rationales for the contested status of free blacks, and that, at this time, the federal government's role in determining the parameters of the claimable rights of individuals was largely restricted to establishing the requirements for naturalization and the requirements for alien ownership of federal lands, which is incredibly important for voting. The fragility of hierarchies of race is inherent to the project of racialism, rather than emanating from some assuredness regarding the morphological provenance of racialized personhood and unpersonhood. What we see here is the adoption of specific policy practices in order to construct a world in which the insurrectionist against domination that the American Revolution represented could coexist with the continued brutal exploitation that slavery represented. And so the slave was not created so that the American might exist. Instead, the black was created so that slavery might survive Republican fervor. Indeed, we must be careful about operating at a level of abstraction which would enable the post hoc justifications of enslavement concocted by Southern slave owners embattled by a crisis of legitimacy to shape the historiography of chattel slavery. Wilderson and Sexton want us to believe that the myriad forms of exploitation, indentured servitude, ghettoization, mass incarceration, police brutality, etc., which followed the formal abolition of slavery constitute a continuation of enslavement or its afterlife, and that this position of the slave is fundamentally different from the position of the white or Indian indentured servant, who often performs labor whose resistance incurred violent repression. Such a framework mystifies three crucial facts. First, that the blackness of the category of slave was both contingent and unstable. Second, that to exceptionalize African enslavement obscures the many categories of alien which were comparable to the Negro in the U.S. context. Third, the natal alienation was not from some African collectivity, but specific and diverse social formations in Western Africa. Okay, here I'm just gonna pause and say that all of these post hoc rationalizations still came into play, such that we can still find that continuity between slavery and the prison system. So we can still definitely see that continuity still play out. But as she says, we have to be careful of these post hoc rationalizations. That is, what I'm trying to say is what Wilkinson argues is not necessarily wrong. It's just that those post hoc rationalizations still come into play regardless. So this is a little bit of a critique of the article I'm reading right now. However, her general argument is still right on the ball. Between the nigger and the kafir, there can be no such thing as rigorously identical cultures. To believe one can create a black culture is to forget, oddly enough, that Negroes are in the process of disappearing, since those who created them are witnessing the demise of their economic and cultural supremacy. Frantz Fanon. I think many people here would disagree with her reading of Fanon. I think it's perfect, but let's just keep going. Thus, we return to the second premise of Afro-Pessimist theory, a necessary conceptual convergence between the African and the Negro. Wilderson parses this logic flippantly. Slaveness is something that has consumed blackness and Africanness, making it impossible to divide slavery from blackness. This convergence is developed in greater depth by Sexton. I think that she has a really good point here, and that's the Morgan Freeman point, is that we are reiterating the white man's burden by taking up basically the tools of the master. We become once again slaves. The convergence is developed in greater depth by Sexton. As in the case of black immigrants to the United States, the movements of decolonization in Africa encountered the racial calculus and political arithmetic of slavery as an internal limit on their capacity to claim national or regional or continental sovereignty and independence in the manner of their Asian and Latin American comrades. The manner in which Africanness disappears into blackness is indeed suspect. It distorts the conceptual space between the Negro and the African, which Fanon elaborates. In short, the Afro-American scholars' desire for an American genealogy of slaveness is to overwhelm the complex encounters between Africans and imperialism alone, however fierce his intuition is, cannot make it as such. In large part, the problem for Wilderson and Sexton is that their analysis takes for granted the salience of phenotypical registers of blackness. They read Fanon presuming that his different registers of black are one and the same. This can be addressed by a return to his more resonance text of the period, The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon explicitly argues that the relationship between national consciousness on the African continent and the shared African consciousness does not rest upon a metaphysical principle, but on the mindfulness to rule what a colonialism which lingers anywhere possesses a threat to freedom everywhere. In his essay on a national culture, he addresses these different registers head on. Transformed by his experience as part of the Algerian Revolution, he revisits negritude, which he had previously described as his last chance. He argues that once the concept of negritude had been elaborated, his project of establishing the existence of an African culture with the inner dynamism of distinctive national cultures faced serious problems. He goes on. Now, before I read that, I find it very interesting how on the one hand, we are really overregulating our words in the public space, but on the other hand, we don't actually think about how the cognitive behavioral therapy principles, the pop psychology principles, go with regards to matters of Black pessimism. You can see that there's definitely these contradictions that exist. So on the one hand, you see that the cognitive behavioral therapy principles go with what Morgan Freeman says, we need to erase and stop talking about it. But on the other hand, so we can see that this cognitive dissonance exists within the left right now. So he goes on. Gradually, the Black Americans realized that their existential problems differed from those faced by the Africans, but once the initial comparisons had been made and subjective feelings had settled down, the Black Americans realized that the objective problems were fundamentally different. The principle and purpose of the freedom rides whereby Black and white Americans endeavor to combat racial discrimination have little in common with the heroic struggle of the Angolan people against the inequity of Portuguese colonialism. We have to respect particularity here. We really have to respect particularity. And right now we go into these Buddhist temples in the far reaches of China, and we try to instill principles of intersectionality there. This is actually happening. The United Nations does this. It's really crazy. The point can be elaborated through a comparison of the impulses that distinguish processes of racialization in the antebellum US from those of colonial Africa. Orlando Patterson's social death thesis, which Wilderson and Sexton take as inherent to the Black condition, posits three elements of coercive power in slavery: violence, dishonor, and natal alienation. It is easy to see that all three manifested in the condition of Black slave in the Americas. Dislocated from kinship relations and subjected to brutal relations of force, their political existence had been destroyed. Try as they might, Sexton and Wilderson generalizes of natal alienation as embedded in the Black condition cannot stand against the empirical evidence that we now have regarding the technologies of colonial rule. That's what the X in Malcolm X is supposed to represent. In colonial Southern Africa, the need for labor to service the farms, mines, and industries set up by settlers for the purpose of capital accumulation necessitated interventions in the pre-capitalist social functions that still existed in the periphery. On the one hand, back to the text, labor needed to be geographically mobile. This meant that formal, predominantly male workforce needed to spend increasing periods of time away from the homestead. On the other, labor migrancy presented the possibility of detribalization, disrupting birth rates, and the possibility of full proletarianization. Consequently, urban centers and the rural periphery had an interdependent but contradictory relationship in which the colonial administrators required both the integration of the native into capitalistic wage labor and the maintenance of elements of pre-existing relationships to preserve the ability to reproduce the workforce. The contradictions between legitimacy and accumulation meant that colonial authorities frequently intervened to strengthen the hold of kinship bonds in order to secure young men's labor in a system of indirect rule. Wage labor was ethnicized, and ethnic identity often determining which forms of labor were performed. Workers were often employed through tribal authorities. Thus, the African's primary relationship to the state was neither as a worker nor as a black, but as Xhosa, Zulu, etc. These cultural identities were in turn stabilized as biological lineages. This fragmentary worker status in which an interaction between the urban mining and cash crop areas of the ethnicized homestead was institutionally mandated, refracted relations of super exploitation. So we can see that there's a big contradiction going on, and that contradiction is between how in some cases where capitalists go, they strengthen the patriarchal relationships so that they can use the workforce fully. But on the other hand, this neoliberal version of capitalism goes and actually destroys these cultural traditions. And this kind of combination, both are at the capitalist's hands. They can go in and destroy traditions, or they can go in and strengthen traditions. It really depends on whether those traditions can be subsumed into the imperial structure. And that's what the culture of anthropology, the study of anthropology was all about. Anthropology was, first you send out these anthropologists to study the people that live there, to see how you can specifically exploit them. I think that both the writer here and the writer she's criticizing, they both do something which is universalize. The one says that the traditions are destroyed. The other says that, no, the traditions are strengthened. But I really think it depends on the anthropological relationships with that specific culture and how the Queen Victoria, decided to proceed with regards to those specific traditions. I mean, this is the great power of the British Empire. The British Empire can do both. Nothing is off the table. Back to the text. The phenomenon of class ethnic structures stands in stark contrast to the technologies of the transatlantic slave trade. Without a steady stream of slave labor from across an ocean, colonial authorities had to consider the long-term reproduction of the workforce. Without the complete dislocation from traditional hierarchies of authority that the transatlantic passage represented, colonial authorities found themselves competing with pre-existing loyalties and political obligations. Thus, these problems were incorporated and transformed by administrators who sought to stabilize and absorb these pre-colonial socio-political formations. Thus, while it is understandable that the blacks who lived in the United States, Central, and Latin America in fact needed a cultural matrix to cling to, the phenotypical register of blackness obscures much more than it illuminates regarding the various technologies mobilized to violently incorporate Africans into global capitalism. Colonial authorities frequently intervene to strengthen the hold of kinship bonds in order to secure young men's labor in a system of indirect rule. We were to think of these two cases in conjunction, without the baggage of mystifying search for a pragmatic anti-blackness, we see a different set of similarities. She's complicating what's happening here, which is good. Consider, for example, Steve Biko's claim that being black is not a matter of pigmentation, which is elaborated in the logic he advances in addressing the unity under the banner of blackness of those designated as Africans, Indians, and colored by apartheid. What we should at all times look at is the fact that 1. We are all oppressed by the same system. 2. That we are oppressed to varying degrees is a deliberate design to stratify us, not only socially, but also in terms of the enemy's aspirations. 3. Therefore, it is to be expected that in the terms of the enemy's plan, there must be the suspicion, and that if we are committed to the problem of emancipation, to the same degree, it is part of our duty to bring black people the deliberateness of enemy's subjugation scheme. Because second point is crucial. Afro-pessimism treats the distinction between morphological blackness and non-blackness as simply social, which is to say that it conceives of race as a hierarchy of stigma in which the permanently dishonored state of blacks places them outside of humanity. Wilderson and Sexton relegate dynamics of exploitation as incidental to blackness. Pico's point is a corrective to this, opening the door to an exploration of the manner in which the class ethnic structure and its afterlife in post-colonial states mirrors in many ways the class racial structure of U.S. slave society and its afterlife. These structures act to mystify relations of production. We see class relations materially refracted through ethnic and racial lines. Relatedly, the division of labor among racial and ethnic lines. In colonial South Africa, white, African, and Indian workers were incorporated into the structure through the reservation of specific soft, often skilled, roles for these groups. In the US, this manifested first in hierarchies of unwaged labor, then in the active exclusion of blacks from various industries and skilled positions. Thus, when Sexton describes the position of the blacks, a slave is one without standing anywhere, no matter how elevated in role of material circumstance. Even the enslaved state functionary or military conscript, even the manumitted slave gainfully employed awaiting recapture, we must see this move for what it is, an abdication of the part of Afro-pessimism, of a responsibility to contend with both the divergent process of racialization and ethnicization in colonial and slave contexts, and the material reorientation of race and ethnicity spearheaded by the national liberation tradition, in which both Fanon and Bicot situate their work. Indeed, in this light, the incomprehensibility of external superviolence, which characterizes blackness for Wilderson, is exposed as a mystification produced by his own loaded problematic. So basically they're creating their own problems, which is like a lot of what the left does today, just create extra problems for itself, and then you use a lot of emotional labor trying to deal with these secondary problems, and then you don't actually get to the actual freedom part. To educate man to be actional, preserving in all his relations his respect for basic values that constitute a human world, is the prime task of him who, having taken thought, prepares to act. So I think that what I have to offer is not a way out. What I have to offer is an analysis of the problem. She just compared Frantz Fanon's quote with Frank Wilderson's quote. It is often taken for granted that movements which resist dominant forms of exploitation and oppression have the capacity to reproduce themselves in different forms at different points in history. As a result, we are liable to appropriate the language and heroes of past political insurgency and imagine ourselves the bearers of their traditions. This presumption, which unthinkingly ties political traditions of the past to contemporary politics, is quite mistaken. Of course, Marx has a line about tragedy and farce which is now cliched. Perfect. As a consequence, the political salience of historical retrieval is not always immediately obvious, both to organizers who often relate to political tradition through a series of canonical memes, and to history for whom the task of reclaiming context usually serves to trap political logics in the past. Perfect. She's attacking what I'm constantly attacking here, which is the reorganized idioms, the reiterated idioms, and she calls it canonical memes. These memes and idioms are how neoliberalism seeks to destroy us from within. It is easy to imagine why, in the context of global shift in the balance of forces when revolution seemed imminent, the Panthers were able to construct an integrative theory of racial solidarity between people of color, where today we have seen the privatization of various crucial functions of the state state's repressive apparatus. For them, the enemy was visibly unified. The troops on the ground in Vietnam bore the same stars and stripes as the police forces which terrorized black communities in the US. Thus, the literature of the party is replete with striking analyses which are attentive to our capacity to redefine which communities of resistance we see ourselves a part of. The party was able to attend to particular struggles of Afro-Americans while maintaining that the subject of revolution was universal, thus asserting the necessary interdependence of human freedom. Consider, for example, these comments from the party's international coordinator, Connie Matthews' speech at the Vietnam Moratorium demonstration, and Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter and founder of the famous Rainbow Coalition in Chicago. We got to face some facts, that the masses are poor and that the masses belong to what you call the lower class. And when I talk about the masses, I'm talking about the white masses. I'm talking about the black masses and the brown masses and the yellow masses too. We've got to face that fact that some people say you fight fire best with fire, but you say put fire out best with water. You say don't fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. We say you don't fight capitalism with no black capitalism. You fight capitalism with socialism. Fred Hampton. This one's Connie Matthews. Now, whenever the Vietnamese fight, and they are fighting, they have won the war. They are fighting for you here. Now, I am saying that you have had what is known as group freedom, and you are trying to find individual freedom. We are all one people. This is all one country. In fact, the world, we are all one people. So until everyone has known what group freedom is, you are not going to be able to exist in your hippie and yippie societies with individual freedom. Perfect. These, in turn, man, these hippie ideas are dead now. These truly hippie ideas are almost dead. These revolutionary hippie ideas, oh my. These, in turn, echo Bobby Sale's mantra that the best care package that we can send to other liberation struggles around the world is the work that we do at home. Exactly. The Black Panther Party had developed towards this politics of intercommunalism through sustained contact with the national liberation movements of the global south, most notably through Algiers. This engagement opened up the space for the articulation of a universalist politics through the particularity of localized forms of domination. Perfect. It is no wonder, then, that a surviving party reading list includes Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and Studies on a Dying Colonialism, written through the transformative experiences of participation in the Algerian Revolution rather than the Afro-Pessimism flavored black skin white masks. This stands in stark contrast to theoretical tendencies in contemporary anti-Blackness theory. Today, the prevalent engagement with the latter instead of the former has produced readings which extract Fanon from the context of struggle which animate his work, leads people to treat him as simply a theory of race, rather than a revolutionary hero who saw race as a technology of imperialism. However, it is important to remember that the Panthers were not the only ones articulating such a radical form of solidarity. They shared their analyses with the infamous political blackness which now sees the anti-racist left in the UK turn in on itself, as well as the South African black consciousness movement. When the Panthers closed the gap between the local and global arenas, this undermined the ideological stability of racial difference. For South African students, the migrants in Britain, an expansive definition of black, incorporating Africans and Asians, mostly from the subcontinent, in Britain, and African Indians and colored people in South Africa, presented a substantial challenge not only to the systemic racism faced by those colonial and post-colonial subjects within the metropole on the one hand, and at the heart of a settler colonial project of accumulation on the other, but also to the very processes of racialization and ethnicization which mystify the relationships of exploitation. If one can imagine why, in strength, the hand of solidarity is easily extended, this raises pertinent questions about the contemporary political arena. The 1980s neoliberal backlash against the increasing political power of the Third World and its diasporas in the West has resulted in a chronically weak left and a restructuring of the economic and social relationships upon which the communities were conceived. It is in this context that the Black Lives Matter movement and more academically directed decolonization movements, such as Rhodes Must Fall, have emerged and spread across the globe. Both movements and their eponymous slogans, again, she's talking about those idioms, intervene in a historically unprecedented movement where identity-based social justice politics have largely replaced class politics. While union density in Europe and North America is waning and the language of class is increasingly scarce, a new brand of identity politic is on the ascendancy in many arenas, not least university campuses. The 1980s neoliberal backlash against increasing political power of the Third World and its diasporas in the West has resulted in a chronically weak left. Though Afro-Pessimism could do well without contemporary identity politics and intersectionality, it's most... Oh, she did it. She talked about intersectionality. I've been searching critiques of intersectionality and you can't find anything. It's all fucking censored. There's only censorship and political strawmans. It's so sad. It's scary. Though Afro-Pessimism could do well without contemporary identity politics and intersectionality, its most recognizable watchword. Unfortunately, I think she's changed her mind about this. She was a lot more on the ball before. I think she's changed her mind about intersectionality in the ideas that I see now. When people criticize intersectionality, especially colored people, they come at you and they indoctrinate you with everything they have. They don't realize that they are the neoliberal colonizers. One more time. Though Afro-Pessimism could do well without contemporary identity politics and intersectionality, its most recognizable watchword, and in many ways is trying to, is a gap left by intersectionality and accounting for the existence rather than nature of oppression that has brought it into political spaces. Thus, in order to understand the zeitgeist of anti-racist organizing today, we must be allowed to fearlessly interrogate the two as integrative, with an implicit social theory which is profoundly limited in what it conceives of as politically possible. Without the transformative and clarifying power of struggle, the theoretical tension between individual and structure with which Afro-Pessimism is confronted, just like in Crenshaw's juridical theory, wonderful, she attacks the Duluth model right here, is resolved through a particular concept of identity as the manner in which the structure manifests in individuals. Perfect. She's talking about the same thing I'm talking about, which is this pop psychology stuff where we are gaslighted as an individual problem rather than a collective problem. This leaves us with a social theory that treats structures of dominations as pathogenic, again, making ideological problems into problems of clinicalization, which is what the APA does, creating multiple oppressor and oppressed binaries. Again, the pathologization of the oppressed, this politics of pathologizes privilege. Exactly. Oh my God, she's right on the ball here. What happened? It results in a logic which dictates that not to share in the experiences which are generalized among a given group is to be implicated in the oppression of that group. In other words, it means that the impossibility of genuine solidarity. I love this article. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I disagree with, but overall, it's amazing. Afro-Pessimism meets this charge by positioning an anti-Black solidarity among non-Black people. Thus, it is concerning that the framework acts as a mechanism of determining social power, the right to speak on or organize around issues in political spaces with three key premises. Firstly, collapsing the distinction between Blackness as a project of mystification, along with its social, political, and economic processes of non-consensual ethnicization, and Africanness as a historical fact. Secondly, the essentialization of Blackness as a coherent and stable category that was invested with a set of stigmatizing values by imperial encounters, rather than being de facto created by the imperial encounters themselves. Third, the collectivization of Black trauma with an imaginary which is reminiscent of Black nationalism that sees transatlantic slave trade as simultaneously an origin story, amazing, it is an origin story, and an albeit crucial event in the longer trajectory of a coherent people. Oh my goodness, that was so on the ball. This woman has definitely read some Derrida, I guess, or knows derivatives of Derrida. What then are we fighting for? I want to open the door to this critical but absent conversation about anti-racist organizing. The space for such conversation is desperately needed. Indeed, many of the claims about race that I have challenged created a suffocating climate in the last decade in which dissent from shared assumptions and attempts to develop theoretical grounds for solidarity are routinely characterized as anti-black. Again, that's the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor. Thinking back to the words of Fanon and Wilderson, which opened this conclusion, we see a contrast that illuminates phenomena responsible for the contemporary prominence of this particular language of black exceptionalism. However, the best that this politics can offer us is a fight without a purpose, since the account of how the world works genuinely believe these identities and the conflicts which they purportedly entail are insurmountable. Its conception of emancipation is either messianic, genocidal, or it otherwise does not believe that emancipation is possible. Thus, anti-blackness, an unrelenting and totalizing beast, an omnipresent hindrance to selfhood, is impossible to effectively resist. Like Franon's French Negro, freedom in this account must come to blacks from without. That is, your ideology must be critiqued from the outside. The struggle is pointless, and yet, for this very reason, having abdicated liberatory struggle in favor of despair, when dancing in the ashes of the end of the world, we should still know nothing of the cost of freedom. Amazing. Thank you.